The first wave of the assault was an olfactory invasion, a rank, gamey stench, the unmistakable musk of stressed animal that slammed into Chief Jessica Drake of the city's Urban Wildlife Control Division the instant she stepped from her city-issued hybrid onto her father's normally meticulously kept flagstone patio. It was a primal odor, sharp and unsettling, clawing its way through the cloying sweetness of freshly overturned damp earth and the brutalized perfume of shredded vegetation. Then her eyes registered the visual devastation, a panorama of ruin that felt like a physical blow. Arthur Drake's beloved rehabilitation garden, his hard-won sanctuary, his meticulously ordered patch of vibrant green that had been coaxed with almost religious devotion from the unforgiving dense clay soil of their modest suburban lot, was an utter heartbreaking wreck. Tomato plants, which only the previous afternoon had stood as proud sentinels laden with the promise of ripening ruby-red fruit, were torn violently from their stakes. Their sturdy limbs snapped and twisted, their precious green globes pulped into the scarred mud like casualties of a senseless bombardment. Rows of crisp romaine lettuce and tender young spinach, planted with the precision of a seasoned soldier, were flattened, ripped from their beds, and scattered with a wild, furious abandon, as if a miniature, malevolent tornado had vented its spleen solely upon them. His prize-winning zinnias, a defiant riot of explosive color, crimson, orange, sunshine, yellow, that had been his particular pride, a vibrant symbol of life's tenacity, were decapitated, their bright, cheerful heads strewn across the churned earth like macabre confetti on a battlefield. The air, usually alive with the gentle hum of bees and the subtle fragrance of basil and thyme, now carried only the scent of violation. And then she saw them, 4 raccoons, bold as brass in the bruised light of the late afternoon, their masked faces usually conveying a roguish charm, now peering at her with an unnerving, almost insolent intelligence from amidst the shredded ruins of a prized peace rosebush. One larger than the others was methodically, almost contemptuously, stripping unripe berries from a blueberry cane Arthur had nurtured with painstaking care for 3 long years, its delicate branches now broken and trailing. Her father, Arthur Drake, a man whose quiet courage had been forged in the crucible of foreign wars, a decorated combat veteran who had faced down enemy fire in distant, unforgiving landscapes, stood amidst the chaos. His shoulders, which even in retirement usually retained a hint of military straightness, were slumped, defeated. His face, a landscape Jessica knew so well, usually etched with a gentle resilience, and the quiet wisdom of survival, was a mask of bewildered, silent devastation. His hands, those hands that had once expertly handled weaponry, and later with equal precision, the most delicate of seedlings, hung limply at his sides, trembling almost imperceptibly. For a long, searing moment, Jessica, the seasoned professional, the chief, who managed complex urban ecosystems and navigated the often fraught politics of human-wildlife conflict, felt only the raw, helpless rage of a daughter witnessing her father's fragile, hard-won peace being savagely, inexplicably violated. It was a desecration. Then the years of training, the ingrained discipline, kicked in a cool wave, washing over the heat of her fury. Her mind began to segment the scene, analyzing, cataloging. This wasn't just random animal damage. She'd seen hundreds of cases of nuisance wildlife. This was different, too targeted, too destructive, too orchestrated. The meticulous roused the prized blooms. It was as if the creatures had been guided by a malevolent intelligence. The question that formed in her mind, sharp and insistent, wasn't just what had happened, but who, or what, had made it happen, and why they would unleash such calculated, devastating chaos on a place so clearly dedicated to healing and quiet contemplation. Arthur Drake's journey home from war hadn't ended with his discharge papers. His most challenging, most relentless battles had been fought not on foreign soil, but in the echoing, often terrifying silence of his own mind. Post-traumatic stress disorder, a constant thrumming anxiety that lay like a coiled snake in his gut, and a persistent, frustrating tremor in his hands were the unwelcome, indelible souvenirs of his service. His small backyard garden started on a whim, a hesitant suggestion from Dr. Evans, his patient VA therapist. Find something tactile, Arthur, something that grounds you, something that grows, had become his lifeline, his therapy, his quiet, fiercely protected corner of sanity in a world that often felt too loud, too fast, too overwhelmingly demanding. Jessica remembered the early days of the garden, the sheer physical effort her father had poured into it, double-digging the stubborn, impacted clay, his face grim with determination, sweat stinging his eyes. He'd amended the soil with load after load of compost and sand, his movements sometimes jerky with tremor, other times surprisingly fluid, as he lost himself in the rhythm of the work. Each seed, planted each weed meticulously, almost ritually pulled each perfectly ripe tomato or crisp cucumber harvested, was a small, hard-won victory, a tangible connection to life growth and the reassuring predictability of natural cycles. He had transformed the barren, neglected patch behind his modest suburban home into a vibrant, productive oasis, a living testament to patience, nurturing, and the quiet miracle of renewal. There were neat, orderly rows of vegetables: beans, peas, peppers, squash, fragrant culinary herbs spilling from terracotta pots, and carefully chosen flowers that exploded in bursts of defiant, joyful color, attracting bees and butterflies, their gentle industry a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within him. It was here, amidst the scent of warm earth and blooming lavender, that Arthur found his equilibrium. It was here that the intrusive memories, the sudden disorienting flashes of chaos and fear, sometimes receded, replaced by the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the satisfying weight of a watering can. It was here that the tremors in his hands, a constant source of frustration and embarrassment, occasionally stilled as he gently pruned his rose bushes or tied up his sprawling tomato vines. Jessica, whose own life was a perpetual juggling act, understood with a fierce, protective clarity the profound, almost sacred therapeutic value of her father's garden. It was far more than just a hobby. It was his anchor, his sanctuary, the physical manifestation of his ongoing battle for peace. The jarring, discordant note in their otherwise quiet, carefully curated suburban symphony was Mrs. Agnes Albright. President of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association, Agnes was a woman whose perfectly coiffed, almost helmet-like arrangement of steely gray hair and perpetually pursed lips seemed to signify a permanent state of disapproval with the world at large, and Arthur's garden in particular. From the moment Arthur first broke ground, transforming what had been a patch of struggling lawn into tilled earth, Mrs. Albright had viewed his burgeoning project with thinly veiled suspicion, an attitude that quickly curdled into open, simmering hostility. Her initial comments, delivered over the low fence that separated their properties, were swathed in a veneer of saccharine, neighborly concern that didn't quite reach her cold, assessing eyes. "Arthur, dear." She'd trilled one spring morning, her gaze sweeping critically over his newly planted rows of seedlings, each tiny plant marked with a neat, handwritten label. "Such ambitious plans for your little patch, aren't they? One does hope it won't become too, well, untidy. We do pride ourselves on a certain level of manicured uniformity here in Oak Haven Estates, you know. Visual harmony is so important for property values." Her own yard was a sterile expanse of perfectly edged, unnaturally green lawn, punctuated by a few rigidly pruned flowerless shrubs. It looked to Jessica like a place where joy went to die. The first direct salvo in what would become Mrs. Albright's undeclared war on Arthur's garden occurred about a year after he started it, just as the garden was truly beginning to flourish, a testament to his dedication. Arthur, diligently following Dr. Evans's advice to engage in sustainable grounding practices, had built a small, discreet compost bin behind his garden shed. It was a simple three-sided structure made of untreated pine, designed to turn kitchen scraps and yard waste into precious black gold for his soil. Mrs. Albright, apparently possessing an almost supernatural ability to detect any perceived infraction of her exacting unwritten neighborhood standards, had materialized at his fence line the very next day, her face a mask of indignation. "Arthur," she'd announced, her voice sharp with accusation resonating with the authority she clearly felt her HOA presidency bestowed upon her, "I must insist you remove that refuse pile immediately. It is an olfactory offense of the highest order, a blatant violation of HOA covenants regarding the proper disposal of yard waste, which I might add is collected curbside every Tuesday. And it will undoubtedly attract vermin, rats, raccoons, possums, all sorts of undesirables. I simply will not have it. This neighborhood will not be overrun by pests because of your ill-conceived projects." Thito. Arthur, a man of few words, but deep, unshakable convictions, had calmly, patiently explained that it was a properly maintained compost bin, essential for enriching his soil organically, that it was not emitting any offensive odors. Indeed, it smelled only faintly of damp earth, and that it was well within the rather vague HOA guidelines for garden accoutrements. Jessica, called in by her father not to fight his battle but to provide expert clarification given her profession, had politely but firmly backed him up. She cited local ordinances regarding responsible composting, pointed out the environmental benefits, and even offered to show Mrs. Albright educational materials from her own department. Mrs. Albright had listened with an expression of stony displeasure, her lips tightening into a thin, uncompromising line, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently on the fence post. "We shall see about that, Jessica." She'd sniffed her gaze, dismissive. "Some people," she added, her voice carrying clearly as she turned on her heel and marched back towards her own impeccably sterile, flowerless domain, "simply have no respect for community standards or the sensitivities of their neighbors." The air vibrated with her disapproval. The battle for Arthur's garden, Jessica realized with a sinking heart, had officially commenced. Adding another layer of friction was their other immediate neighbor, Mr. Gerald Henderson, a perpetually disgruntled retiree, whose primary mode of communication seemed to be complaining. While Agnes Albright obsessed over aesthetics and perceived violations of HOA covenants, Henderson's grievances were more elemental, often centering on noise smells or anything that threatened his narrowly defined sense of suburban tranquility. Arthur's compost bin became Henderson's new bête noire. Drake. Henderson had bellowed across the fence one morning, his face flushed a mottled red, interrupting Arthur's quiet contemplation of his burgeoning zucchini plants. That stink pile of yours is a public nuisance. I saw a rat, a big one, near my garbage cans yesterday. It's your damn compost attracting them. You're single-handedly turning this neighborhood into a refuse dump. It's a health hazard, man." Arthur had tried to reason with him, explaining again the sealed nature of the composter, the lack of actual odor, the fact that rats were unfortunately a part of any urban environment, often drawn to improperly secured garbage rather than well-managed compost. Jessica had even intervened, offering Henderson advice on securing his own bins and explaining that Arthur's composting practices were sound. Henderson, however, remained unconvinced, muttering about hippie nonsense and inviting disease. He became another source of low-grade persistent stress for Arthur, another pair of critical eyes watching his every move in the garden. The rising action of Mrs. Albright's campaign, occasionally amplified by Henderson's grumbling, was a series of escalating aggressions, a clear pattern of harassment designed to undermine Arthur's peace, and it seemed systematically destroy his therapeutic refuge. The initial complaints to the HOA, anonymous but clearly bearing Agnes's fingerprints, citing noxious odors emanating from the Drake property and uncontrolled jungle-like vegetation, were met with official letters that Arthur, with Jessica's help, calmly and factually refuted. When these indirect tactics failed to yield the desired result, Arthur's abandonment of his garden, the sabotage began. The first truly shocking incident, beyond her constant carping and attempts to rally other more ambivalent neighbors to her cause with dire predictions of impending rodent infestations and plummeting property values, involved direct, albeit petty, physical interference. Arthur awoke one crisp spring morning to find that several of his newly planted, incredibly delicate tomato seedlings, the fragile beginnings of his summer crop, carefully nurtured indoors from seed, had been inexplicably uprooted and tossed aside, their tender roots exposed to the harsh morning sun, dooming them. A few days later, a patch of his prize-winning marigolds, planted specifically along his bean rows to deter nematodes, mysteriously withered and died almost overnight, the soil around their shriveled stems smelling faintly, almost imperceptibly, of bleach or some other harsh chemical. There was no direct proof linking these acts to Mrs. Albright, or even to the perpetually aggrieved Mr. Henderson. But the incidents always uncannily occurred after a particularly pointed comment from Agnes about the untidiness of his expanding vegetable patch or the garishness of his vibrant flowers, or after a fresh tirade from Henderson about the compost fumes. Each act of vandalism, small and deniable in itself, was a fresh stab at Arthur's already fragile peace, leaving him agitated, his sleep disturbed, his tremors more pronounced. He started checking his garden compulsively, his anxiety a palpable presence. The second deeply disturbing incident was a direct verbal assault on Arthur while he was quietly tending his beloved rose bushes, his hands, for a rare, blessed moment that afternoon, relatively steady as he snipped away spent blooms. Mrs. Albright had appeared at the fence, her face contorted with an expression of profound disdain that seemed to be her default setting when observing Arthur's activities. "Still playing in the dirt, are we, Arthur?" She'd sneered, her voice dripping with a condescension that was almost physically painful to imagine. "Some of us, you know, contribute to the community in more significant ways. This obsessive digging of yours, it's rather pathetic, isn't it? Almost like you're trying to bury something you can't ever truly escape." The cruel, calculated insinuation, clearly referencing his past trauma, his ongoing battle with PTSD, was not lost on Arthur. He hadn't responded, hadn't given her the satisfaction of a reaction. He had simply turned his back, his shoulders hunched, as if against a physical blow, the simple joy he'd been feeling in his gardening, evaporating under the heat of her malice. He'd retreated into the house, leaving his pruning shears abandoned by the rose bush. When Jessica heard about this particular exchange later that evening, her father recounting it in a low, hesitant voice, his usual stoicism momentarily fractured, her simmering anger solidified into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about a neighborhood squabble over a garden anymore. This was about protecting her father's mental health, his painstakingly constructed sanctuary from a relentless, unfeeling bully. She had confronted Mrs. Albright directly the next morning, meeting her at the property line as Agnes was retrieving her newspaper. "Mrs. Albright." Jessica had said, her voice calm, but laced with an authority that brooked no argument, her official city chief badge subtly visible on her belt. "Your comments to my father yesterday were unacceptable and frankly cruel. His garden is his therapy, a vital part of his well-being, and your persistent harassment is causing him significant distress. This is your final official warning. If this pattern of harassment continues, I will pursue all available legal avenues to protect him, including filing for a restraining order and documenting these incidents as potential elder abuse, given his veteran status and known health conditions." Mrs. Albright had merely laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that grated on Jessica's nerves. "Legal avenues, don't be absurd, Jessica. I am merely expressing my legitimate concern for neighborhood standards and property values, which your father's experiments are clearly jeopardizing." And frankly, her eyes narrowed. "Your father's sensitivities are not my problem, nor are they the neighborhood's. Perhaps this community isn't the right fit for people who can't handle a bit of honest, constructive feedback." Her defiance was absolute, her belief in her own righteousness seemingly unshakable. The threat of legal action, Jessica realized with a sinking feeling, had not deterred her. It seemed only to have emboldened her, perhaps even to have been taken as a challenge. The midpoint twist, the discovery that began to recontextualize Mrs. Albright's vendetta and hinted at a more calculated, insidious, and frankly almost diabolical strategy, came about through a convergence of Jessica's professional expertise, a growing gnawing suspicion, and a series of unsettling, almost subliminal clues. The increasing localized damage to Arthur's garden, specific plants targeted, others left untouched always after a confrontation or a fresh complaint, didn't quite align with typical patterns of random urban wildlife foraging. Raccoons and squirrels were opportunistic, messy, yes, but usually not so, selective or vindictively precise. Then Arthur mentioned something that pricked Jessica's attention. He'd seen Mrs. Albright frequently setting up and adjusting what looked like a small camouflage trail camera in her own backyard, discreetly mounted on a mature oak tree that overlooked not only her own sterile lawn, but also provided a clear view towards the wooded area, behind their properties, and crucially across the fence into Arthur's garden. When Arthur had politely inquired, Agnes had claimed with an uncharacteristically flustered air that it was to document the lovely local fauna for a nature blog. She was allegedly starting a pastime that seemed utterly incongruous with her usual disdain for anything wild or uncontrolled. Simultaneously, Mr. Henderson, in one of his louder lamentations to another neighbor, overheard by Jessica, had dramatically claimed to have seen a whole family of raccoons brazenly parading across his own lawn at dusk, heading towards Arthur's compost. "It's an infestation, I tell you, Drake's inviting them." Yet Arthur himself, a keen observer of his garden's ecosystem, had seen no such family, only the usual solitary nocturnal visitors. Jessica, her urban wildlife control instincts now on high alert, began to suspect something far more complex than simple neighborly animosity. She did some discreet online research. She discovered that Mrs. Albright had in fact been loudly and repeatedly complaining on a neighborhood online forum about a plague of raccoons, congregating near the community's dumpster area, which was located several blocks away from their homes near the main entrance to Oakhaven Estates. She demanded the HOA take immediate action to trap and remove them, portraying herself as a concerned citizen battling a public menace. It felt like a classic misdirection, a carefully constructed narrative. Then, through a trusted contact in a neighboring municipality's animal control department, a colleague with whom she often shared information on regional wildlife trends, Jessica learned something truly alarming. Agnes Albright had recently, within the last month, purchased several large professional-grade humane live traps, officially citing the need for protecting her own property from nuisance wildlife. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. Mrs. Albright wasn't just passively encouraging pests by perhaps leaving out food scraps near Arthur's garden or conveniently forgetting to secure her own garbage cans to draw them closer. It was entirely possible, Jessica realized with a lurch of her stomach that felt like free-falling, that Agnes was actively, deliberately trapping raccoons from other areas, perhaps the very ones she was so publicly complaining about near the dumpsters, thus creating her own evidence of a problem, and then under the cloak of darkness, maliciously relocating and releasing them into or directly adjacent to her father's property. The intent to cause maximum damage to stress, and to finally drive Arthur to abandon his garden, or perhaps even to drive him out of Oakhaven Estates altogether. The trail camera wasn't for observing lovely local fauna. It was likely to document her carefully orchestrated raccoon problem for the HOA, or worse, to sadistically record the destruction of Arthur's garden for her own private twisted satisfaction. The woman wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance, a petty tyrant of the HOA. She was potentially engaging in illegal wildlife trapping and relocation, a serious offense, and weaponizing innocent animals to harass and psychologically torture a vulnerable individual, a combat veteran with known PTSD. The sheer calculated cruelty of it, the premeditated malice, was breathtaking. Jessica knew she needed concrete proof, but her professional intuition, honed by years in the field, was screaming red alert. This harrowing realization brought them to this devastating afternoon, the air thick with the musky scent of terrified, displaced raccoons and the heartbreaking, visceral sight of Arthur's ruined sanctuary. After ensuring her father was safely inside the house, settled in his worn armchair with a lukewarm cup of tea he likely wouldn't drink, and the television murmuring unnoticed, though his eyes were distant, haunted, replaying horrors only he could see, Jessica went into full professional mode. Her initial daughterly rage congealed into a cold, focused determination. This was no longer just a personal concern, a family matter. This was an active wildlife incident, potentially involving illegal trapping and release animal cruelty. Endangerment of public health, stressed relocated animals can be unpredictable and significant, malicious property damage. She retrieved her own professional-grade motion-activated night vision trail camera from the locked compartment in her work vehicle, along with a set of humane traps bait and evidence collection bags. With methodical precision, she began to document the existing damage to Arthur's garden. She took dozens of photographs with her phone, her internal narration, a dry, professional assessment. Point of entry appears to be from southeastern fence line adjacent to Henderson property. Plant matter shredded, not consumed, consistently indicative of stress or agitation in animals. Root systems exposed. Tracks consistent with Procyon lotor, multiple individuals. Selective targeting of fruiting bodies and prized ornamental cultivars, inconsistent with typical opportunistic foraging patterns in established territories. It was undeniably raccoon behavior, but the sheer intensity and concentration of it in one specific unfenced garden, while neighboring yards, including Agnes's own pristine lawn, remained untouched, was highly suspicious, almost aberrant. She set her camera up discreetly camouflaged amongst the remaining battered foliage of a hardy rhododendron, angled to cover the most heavily damaged section of Arthur's garden, and crucially the low fence line shared with Mrs. Albright's property, as well as the overgrown, unkempt rear corner of Mr. Henderson's lot, which provided dense cover and a plausible deniability route of approach. She also set 2 humane live traps baited with a mixture of marshmallows and sardines, an irresistible raccoon delicacy, near the most likely points of entry and egress, her movements quick, efficient, born of long practice. Then she waited, a knot of dread and anticipation tightening in her chest. Before leaving her father's for the night, she also reviewed the footage from the small security camera Arthur had installed facing his back gate and patio after the earlier incidents of minor vandalism. It was on a continuous loop, and she scanned the past 24 hours. Nothing from the previous night, the night of the major destruction, showed any human activity near the garden, only the shadows of the raccoons themselves. The irrefutable proof the smoking gun came sooner than she expected, though not in the way she initially anticipated. Reviewing the footage from her own newly placed trail camera the very next morning, Jessica's blood ran cold, then boiled with a righteous, incandescent fury. The footage was grainy time-stamped at 2:17 a.m., but the figure it captured was unmistakably chillingly Agnes Albright. Clad in dark, unobtrusive clothing, a knit cap pulled low over her silver hair, she moved with a furtive, cautious energy. She was carrying a wire animal trap, similar in make and model to the ones Jessica knew from her contact that Agnes had purchased. The trap clearly contained a struggling, agitated raccoon, its eyes glinting wildly in the infrared light. The footage showed Agnes carefully, almost stealthily, approaching the fence line, not directly into Arthur's garden, but at the far unkempt rear corner of Mr. Henderson's property, a dense thicket of overgrown bushes and untrimmed trees that directly abutted Arthur's most vulnerable vegetable beds. With a quick, practiced movement, Agnes opened the trap door, releasing the frantic animal, which immediately bolted through the undergrowth in the direction of Arthur's garden. Then Agnes quickly, silently retreated back onto her own property. A few minutes later, the camera captured her returning with another trap, and then a third, and a fourth, releasing a total of 4 disoriented, terrified raccoons in quick succession into the same spot on Henderson's property line, effectively using his yard as a launch pad. The final damning piece of footage showed her pausing for a long moment, a small, cruel, deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips, as the first sounds of rustling and destruction could be heard from the direction of Arthur's now unseen garden. Then, with a last triumphant glance, she retrieved what looked like her own trail camera from a nearby tree on her side of the fence, clearly having filmed her handiwork, her evidence of a neighborhood pest problem. Jessica felt a wave of nausea, then a surge of cold, hard anger. Agnes hadn't just weaponized these animals, she'd cleverly, diabolically attempted to frame Mr. Henderson, or at least to create plausible deniability by using his property as a conduit. The sheer cunning, the layers of deception, were as horrifying as the act itself. She immediately called her most trusted senior field officer, Tom Sanchez, a man of immense experience and unflappable calm. "Tom," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I need you and a small discreet crew at my father's address in Oak Haven Estates ASAP. We have an active situation involving illegal trapping and release of raccoons, Class B misdemeanor under state wildlife code, plus significant property damage, animal cruelty, and targeted harassment. And it's complicated." Next, she dialed the direct line for Detective Maria Ramirez, the local police liaison her department frequently worked with on cases involving animal cruelty or illegal wildlife activities that crossed into criminal statutes. "Ramirez," she said, switching lines, "it's Drake. I'm at my father's. I've got a situation here that's going to need your immediate attention. I have video evidence of the perpetrator in a malicious destruction and illegal wildlife release case. This one's going to be delicate and potentially high profile given the perpetrator's HOA status." When Tom Sanchez and his 2-person crew arrived, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes sharp with professional curiosity, Jessica, acting in her official capacity as urban wildlife control chief, supervised the humane trapping of the 4 disoriented and now rather disgruntled raccoons. As she had suspected, they were not native to this immediate microhabitat. They were thinner, more agitated, and less wary than the established local raccoons, clearly stressed from being trapped, transported, and released into unfamiliar territory. They were temporarily secured in transport carriers for veterinary assessment and eventual safe relocation to a suitable, more remote habitat far from human conflict. Then, with Detective Ramirez and two uniformed officers now present their patrol cars parked discreetly down the street, Jessica walked over to Mrs. Albright's meticulously kept house. She carried a department-issued tablet cued to the incriminating video footage. Mr. Henderson, alerted by the quiet commotion and the sight of official vehicles, had emerged onto his own porch, his face a mixture of apprehension and bewildered curiosity. Mrs. Albright answered the door, her perfectly applied lipstick a slash of crimson against her pale skin. Her expression was one of feigned, polite surprise, which quickly morphed into indignant outrage when she saw Detective Ramirez and the uniformed officers standing slightly behind Jessica. Jessica, Detective Ramirez officers, what on earth is the meaning of this? Are you harassing me now with official city resources because of a few stray animals in Arthur's rather chaotic yard? Her voice dripped with affronted innocence. Agnes Albright. Jessica said, her voice calm, professional, but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority, each word carefully chosen. We have a serious matter to discuss regarding the deliberate malicious destruction of my father's property and the illegal trapping and illicit release of wildlife, specifically 4 raccoons, onto or directly adjacent to his garden between approximately 2:00 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. this morning, originating from the rear of Mr. Henderson's property facilitated by you. Mrs. Albright scoffed a sound like tearing silk. Raccoons don't be utterly ridiculous, Jessica. They are a neighborhood menace, as I have repeatedly stated. If some happened to wander into Arthur's messy, overgrown patch, which frankly acts as a beacon for every scavenging creature in a 5-mile radius, that is hardly my concern, or Mr. Henderson's. Perhaps if Arthur adhered to HOA standards of neatness and proper waste disposal, they wouldn't be so attracted. She cast a pointed, accusatory glance towards Henderson, who visibly bristled. Perhaps this will refresh your memory, Mrs. Albright, Jessica said, holding up the tablet and playing the damning footage, Agnes dark-clad and furtive, releasing the trapped, frantic raccoons into the shadowy undergrowth of Henderson's property line, her cruel, satisfied smile as the sounds of destruction began. Mrs. Albright's face went slack, her carefully constructed composure shattering like fragile glass. Her eyes widened in horrified disbelief as she watched her own nocturnal activities play out in stark, undeniable detail on the screen. Her skin seemed to gray, the vibrant lipstick suddenly garish. Her carefully constructed facade of indignant innocence crumbled, replaced by a raw, sputtering panic. That's an outrageous invasion of my privacy. She spluttered, her voice rising hysterically, her hands fluttering. You can't film me on my own property, or Mr. Henderson's. This is illegal surveillance. It's entrapment. Actually, Mrs. Albright, Detective Ramirez interjected smoothly, her voice calm but firm. Stepping forward slightly so she was now directly in Agnes's line of sight. Your actions were clearly visible from a public thoroughfare and the neighboring property, and your activities directly and illegally impacted that neighboring property by using it as a conduit for an illegal act. Furthermore, we have credible information that you used your own recording device to document these events. We will be confiscating that device as evidence under warrant, which is being prepared as we speak. Ramirez then took another step forward, her demeanor shifting from explanatory to official. Agnes Albright, you are under arrest for malicious destruction of property, a felony, illegal trapping and relocation of wildlife in violation of City Ordinance 7-14 and State Wildlife Code 3009, both misdemeanors, and targeted harassment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. As Mrs. Albright, now protesting loudly, her voice cracking with a mixture of fury and fear, was gently but firmly handcuffed and led disheveled and stripped of her usual imperious dignity to the waiting patrol car, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered on their lawns and sidewalks. Their faces registered a spectrum of emotions, shocked disbelief, dawning understanding, and in some, a subtle, quickly suppressed flicker of what looked like grim satisfaction. Mr. Henderson stood on his porch, his jaw agape, slowly comprehending how close he had come to being implicated, his initial bewilderment morphing into a visible, simmering anger directed at the now detained Agnes. The reign of Oakhaven's self-appointed queen of conformity, the neighborhood's polished tormentor, was over-ending, not with a bang, but with the click of handcuffs and the distant wail of a misunderstood raccoon. The legal and communal fallout from Mrs. Albright's arrest was swift, significant, and deeply divisive. The 4 raccoons, after a thorough veterinary checkup, confirmed they were healthy, but severely stressed, and underweight, were successfully and humanely relocated by Jessica's urban wildlife control team to a large protected woodland area several miles outside the city, limits far from any residential properties, where they could hopefully readjust to a more natural existence. Mrs. Albright's own trail camera, confiscated under warrant from her home, contained even more damning footage. Not only did it have crystal-clear recordings of her releasing the raccoons, with her muttering gleefully to herself about teaching Arthur a lesson he'll never forget, and ending his disgusting, chaotic mess once and for all, but it also held images from previous weeks showing her engaged in earlier acts of minor vandalism in Arthur's garden, snipping prize blooms in the dead of night, pouring a liquid onto his marigolds. There were even several chilling audio recordings of her muttering to herself about her intention to ruin his so-called peace and make him understand what proper order looks like. A search of her home also uncovered numerous books and pamphlets on pest eradication and non-lethal animal deterrence that bordered on advocating for cruel and unusual methods, revealing a disturbing obsessive preoccupation. Faced with the irrefutable video and audio evidence and the prospect of a very public, very embarrassing trial, Mrs. Albright, on the advice of her increasingly beleaguered attorney, eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including felony destruction of property and violating state wildlife laws. Her sentence included substantial fines, full restitution to Arthur for the extensive damage to his garden, which, with the help of a professional landscaper and horticultural consultant, was estimated at several $1,000s, to repair and replace mandatory intensive psychological counseling, a lengthy period of strictly supervised probation, and most significantly for Arthur's ongoing peace of mind, a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from any contact whatsoever with Arthur or Jessica Drake, and from residing within a 1-mile radius of Arthur's home. Her meticulously kept house in Oakhaven Estates, now a symbol of her downfall, was put on the market shortly thereafter, sold quietly to an out-of-state buyer. The Oakhaven Estates HOA board, deeply embarrassed by the incident, which had attracted unwelcome local media attention, HOA president arrested in raccoon rampage plot, and facing unprecedented pressure from a large contingent of residents who were appalled by Mrs. Albright's actions and in hushed tones by their own previous collective inaction in the face of her long-standing bullying and intimidation tactics, convened an emergency meeting. It was a contentious affair. A small but vocal minority longtime allies of Agnes, or those who genuinely shared her rigid views on neighborhood aesthetics, attempted to minimize her actions. "She just went a bit too far," one resident offered tentatively. "Perhaps she was under stress," another suggested. Arthur's garden, while lovely in its own way, was a bit unconventional for Oakhaven, a third dared to mutter, quickly silenced by glares. Jessica present at her father's quiet request, Arthur himself felt unable to face the potential conflict, calmly dispassionately presented a summary of the evidence, including carefully edited anonymized clips from Agnes's own trail camera. The stark, undeniable visuals of Agnes's calculated cruelty, her venomous muttered threats, and the sheer malice of her actions eventually swayed even the most hesitant board members. A formal public apology was issued to Arthur Drake, and significantly to Mr. Henderson, for the distress and suspicion he had endured. The board, also prodded by pointed suggestions from Jessica's department and the city attorney's office, instituted new, much clearer and more enforceable policies regarding respectful community conduct, conflict resolution, and crucially, the responsible and humane management of urban wildlife. They even, in a surprising turn, agreed to sponsor several educational workshops on coexisting with wildlife and sustainable gardening practices, to be led by Jessica's department. For Arthur Drake, the process of restoring his garden was in itself a profound and necessary form of therapy, a reclaiming of his desecrated sanctuary. Neighbors, many of whom had previously been intimidated into silence by Mrs. Albright, or had simply chosen not to get involved, now came forward with unexpected offers of help. Mrs. Peterson from across the street, a keen rose enthusiast, donated several robust cuttings. Young Timmy Miller from down the block, who Arthur had once shown how to grow sunflowers, proudly presented him with a handful of carefully saved seeds. Even Mr. Henderson, gruffly apologetic for his own earlier belligerence and genuinely shocked at the extent of Agnes's deception, offered his strong back to help clear debris, and in a gesture that surprised everyone, helped Arthur rebuild his compost bin to be more robust and entirely critter-proof, consulting respectfully with Arthur on the design. The garden slowly, painstakingly, but surely began to re-emerge from the devastation stronger, more vibrant, and perhaps more resilient than before its soil, enriched not just with compost, but with the unexpected kindness and shared effort of a community beginning to heal itself. The shared labor of rebuilding fostered new tentative friendships and a renewed, more authentic sense of neighborhood solidarity. Jessica, visiting her father several months later, found him kneeling in the rich, dark earth, his hands remarkably steady, now gently staking a new tomato plant, its leaves a vibrant, healthy green. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile of contentment touched his lips as he surveyed his flourishing domain, the neat rows, the riotous flowers, the buzzing bees. The air was once again filled with the fragrant, comforting scents of warm earth, blooming basil, and sweet alyssum, a fragrant symbol of healing growth and the enduring, indomitable power of a well-tended garden to soothe a veteran's soul and mend a community's fractures. The battle had been ugly, deeply personal, and had tested her resolve to its limits. But it had also allowed her to use her unique skills and authority not just to uphold the law and protect the city's delicate urban ecosystem, but to defend her own family, to restore her father's sanctuary, and in doing so, to bring a measure of hard-won justice and authentic peace to a community that had been for far too long terrorized by one individual's twisted obsession with a cruel and sterile form of order.